Over a year ago, I created an audio visualizer using geometry node. Now, with the new system, we can recreate a similar effect with more control and without any separate modifiers. So let's get started and let's get into it. Alright, so I've opened up a new blend file here and we have just the default scene. I'm just going to go into camera view with numpad 0 and let's select our default cube and hit new to create our new geometry node system. We are going to start off by deleting the default cube, so select the node and just delete it. And we are going to add in a grid. The grid will be the base mesh, basically, which will drive our entire effect. So this is the default grid. And if I go into wireframe mode, you can see we have faces in here as well. And we want to scale this guy up to be about 5 by 5 meters. So it's big enough to fill our scene. And for the vertices, we can increase this number to anything that we want. For example, this is 10 by 10. And I want a number here that adds to the effect, but feel free to change it to whatever you want. So I'm going to go for 60, which worked fine for me. But the higher you go, the more points you get. So the more dense it becomes. Now, what we want to do is we want to displace this grid to basically have this wave modifier effect. If I draw here, what we want is we want to create concentric rings. These are very much not concentric, but hey, you get what I mean?
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
And to do that, we need to first of all change the displacement. So we want, for example, this to be upwards, this to be downwards, and this to be downwards as well, this to be upwards as well, sort of generating a wave type effect. All right, so how can we do this? Well, very simply put, as always, when we want to create displacement, we are going to use a set position node. Now, what this will allow us to do is change the geometry that we have and displace it in a certain direction. If I just change these values, it will displace the entire mesh. But if I add in a more random value, such as a noise texture or a wave texture, which we'll use in this case, it will displace only certain vertices. So let's go ahead and add in a wave texture, like that down here, and take our factor here and plug it into the offset. Now, this does something. It's just not very good looking yet. And that's, first of all, because we are taking a float value, which is a gray output like this one, and we are plugging it into a factor value, which is the purple one. If I disconnect it like so, you will see these are 3 different types of vectors, and this is just one float value, and it will just input it to all 3 of these. We can change this, however, by using a combine XYZ node. What this does is we can take our float value, plug it into only one vector axis, so in this case the Z1, and then take this into the offset, and it will just now change the Z. Front view, this is how it looks. And this is basically sort of the same premise that we used for the waveform audio visualizer I made a while back. So it works, and just going in the Z direction, which is what we want, obviously, it's just not very good looking yet. And first of all, that's because we are using bands and we want to use rings. So if we change this to rings, it's still not looking very good. That's because of the direction the rings are facing in. We want to have them face the same axes that we are using in the combine XYZ. Let's change it to the Z layer here. This works. It's just very, very noisy. However, it is displacing only upward. If I now take the scale and change it to something like a 0.5, this is actually how it looks. And if we change the face offset, we can animate our waves. Before we do anything else, let's automate this animation. I don't want to do it with the manual keyframe style. So instead, what we are going to do is we are going to take a handy node, which comes with Blender 3.1 and up. It's called the scene time node. Take the second and plug it into the face offset. Now hit space, play the animation, and everything should be working. I want to change the FPS here. So it's set to 24 by default. And I'm just going to change this to 30. I advise you to do the same. So this is working, but it is quite slow. Easy way to fix this. Math node, plug it in between, set it to multiply, and multiply it by a value. And I think I used 7 for my final version. So yeah, 7 works fine for me. All right, so now what we have is we have a sort of driver, if you will, with the scene time node multiplied by a value of 7, driving the face offset. So actually creating a complete animation here, but there's no audio input just yet, so nothing is responding to our song. We don't even have a song as of now. First of all, what I want to do is I want to add in these points. So instead of using the grid, I want to use points. And to do that, we are going to convert our mesh, which is basically made up of points, into instances. If we plug in an instance on points node, we now get nothing because we have no instance, but we can basically take anything in here and make sure it appears there. So I'm going to use an icosphere and set it as the instance. Okay, so everything is working again, but the icospheres are way too big. So I'm going to go for 0.04 in this case. And there they are. All right. So next up, we want to actually control this thing with our song here. First of all, I'm going to add in music. So we can actually hear if it's reacting accordingly, if it's hitting all the timings that we want. I'm going to take the plus icon up here and go into the video editing workspace. Now let's make sure we are on frame 1. Very important always. And let's hop on over to this add button here and add in a sound. Now, I'm going to add in the song that I had for this video. So there it is. And it will be way longer than our actual animation. So if I stretch this out, you will see here is where it ends. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to align the playhead with the end of our track here, which seems to be about at 3305. And I'm going to extend the animation. So over here in the frame range to match that. So 3305. And now our animation and our song should match nicely. Let's hop on over back to geometry nodes. And what we want to do next is we want to control the wave texture. So first thing I want to control is the distortion. By default, it's 0, so there's no distortion, and we are going to control this value. But before we do, let's change the detail, set it to 6, and let's change the detail scale to 50. Now nothing is happening, and that's because we aren't adding in any distortion. But if you do add distortion, you will see it becomes pretty dramatic fairly quick. And that's what we want. However, instead of baking our sound directly to the distortion, I want some control over the effect. And in this case, what I need to do is add in a value node and plug that into the distortion. And now we can select our value over here. But before we do, let's make sure we add in a timeline window. So there it is, timeline. Select our value, make sure we're on frame 1 again, and hit I while hovering over our value here. Now, a very handy shortcut for you to know is that when you are hovering inside of your timeline window, you can hit Control Tab and switch between the timeline and the graph editor, which is a very convenient shortcut for animating. So in the graph editor window, let's go to the key menu and hit Bake Sound to F Curve. Select your song and hit Bake Sound to F Curves. This will automatically add in your track baked to the same F curve stuff that you will also hear. So it will respond to the audio that you are hearing nicely. One thing to note though is make sure you are on frame 1 when doing this, or else it won't be synchronized to your music. So now everything is working. You can hear the audio. You can also see something happening. It's just not very strong. And you can see that even in the, well, basically the highest parts of it, the value doesn't go up higher than 0.782 or so. So what I want to do is I want to have some added control over that. I'm going to do this with a map range node, which will allow me to map this value to a new value. So in this case, I'm going to go and take the from max, which is the amount it will maximum distort it. So I'm going to take this to 2, which is not too much. And I'm going to take the 2 max to 5. So what you will see is now it's, especially when it's in the higher regions, is really strong, and on all the other sections it's fairly soft. So really adding to the effect in my opinion. Okay, so that's one of the sound effects that I wanted to add in. But second of all, I want to actually control the overall height of this thing, because I think it's now not doing anything besides the distortion. So what I want to do is I want to take another math node, and I'm going to set this one to multiply as well. And what I want to do is I want to multiply the effect. So you can see if I drag this slider up and down, now there's not so much going on, and now there's a lot going on. And instead of 2 and 5, I think I'm going to go slightly less, so 5 and 2 actually. See how that looks? Yeah, that's better. Okay, so this works. However, I want this to be dynamic as well, so responding to our music again. So Control Tab in here to switch back to our timeline, back to the first keyframe, hit I while hovering over our multiply value, Control and Tab to switch back to our graph editor, key menu, Bake Sound to F Curves, select your song, and let's go. So now we have 2 effects. First of all, we have the distortion going on. And second of all, we have this multiply value, basically telling Blender how dramatic the effect should be depending on the sound. So this is what you get right now. And I think that's looking very, very good already, but it's a tad strong. So I'm going to control the effect overall by adding in another map range. So by plugging in another map range, we have control over the overall output of our wave texture. So I'm going to change this to be about 3 on the from max, sort of drastically limiting,
English, motherfucker, do you speak it?
limiting the effect, but I'm gonna also make it stronger with the 2 max, which I'm gonna set to 1.5 or so. There you go. And this is how it looks right now. And I do feel the distortion can be a bit more dramatic. So I'm going to go from max to max and set both of these to 5. And now we get a nice amount of distortion. All right, so this is basically the entire setup, and it's now sort of looking similar to what we had in the previous video. I think we can go a bit further though, and especially seeing the flexibility that we have right now in geometry nodes, we can definitely make this look a little bit better. And the first thing I want to do is that if I go into top view, you will see that this is a complete square. Now, our wave texture is more of a circle shape, and that's what I want to do with the overall effect as well. So I want this to be more of a circular shape. So instead of messing with the grid, I am going to use a technique in which I'm going to scale down some of these points. So if I set this to 0, the scale on the instance on points, you'll see nothing's visible. And basically what will tell Blender, okay, everything in a circular shape outside of a limited distance should be scaled down to 0. So basically meaning it's invisible. And how can we do this? It's actually very simple with the geometry proximity node. So we have the geometry proximity node, and if I take the distance value, which I'm going to use, and plug it into the scale, everything disappears. And that's because you don't have a target. All right, so as a target, let's give it something to work with. And in this case, I'm going to give it a UV sphere because it's a nice spherical shape, obviously, and plug that into the target. You see something's going on. Okay, so the scale is going up on the outside and it's going in on the inside. And that's not something that we want. You want it inverted. So what we're going to do is, again, we are going to take a map range node. And instead of saying, okay, 0 to 1 and 0 to 1, we want to switch this. So from 0 to 1 to 1 to 0. So let's switch the 2 min to 1 and the 2 max to 0. And now that's working. Things going on here. It's a bit small though. And we can actually change this by creating a bigger fall off with the from max, which I'm going to set to 1.5 or so. But now it's a bit better. We got the effect going on over there. And maybe I'm going to take this down a little bit, set this to 5 or so. Yeah, okay, that's perfect. Set the map range for the multiply value to from max 5. The final thing that I want is I want the scale of these to differ on the height where they are. So what I want is I want them to be 0 or close to 0 when they are in the crevices of our wave. So down here, we just mark that. So over here, I want them to be sort of close to 0, maybe 0.1. And over here on the high parts, I want them to be 1-ish. So we can actually take our height map, which we created, which is basically our wave texture, and use that as a multiplication for the scale. So let's take our math node again, plug that in here. Let's get this guy in the bottom over here, set it to multiply, and then take our factor from our wave texture and plug that into the multiply here. And now you'll see they are big up top and small down below. All right, so that's working perfectly fine. And I'm very happy with how this is looking. Basically wrapped up the entire effect right now. I'm going to summarize it real quick. We started off by creating a grid, which has these vertices, which we can use to increase the amount of points that we get in here. Then we created a set position node, which is basically the displacement of our entire thing here. We plugged in a wave texture and told Blender to only affect the z-axis with the combine XYZ. We then added in our scene time to animate the entire thing looping inward, added some distortion. So we created a animated value node using our sound here and controlled that with a map range to change the distortion of our wave texture. We then multiplied the entire thing again to make it a bit stronger and also get the height to respond to our sound. Then we added in some icospheres on each of the points by adding in an instance on points node and then the icospheres. And finally, we made sure that the scale of our icospheres changes depending on both the height, so the output of our wave texture, and also the closeness towards our UV sphere here. Next though, we want to make it look good, and we also want to make sure our camera is working properly as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select the camera here, hit GZZ to zoom it in on our location here. So there you go, make it a little bit closer, make sure there's nothing outside of our camera bounds here, and we should be good to go. Now let's hop on over to shading and let's start working on our scene here. Now I wanted the background to be black because I don't want any light from our scene bleeding in. And let's select our geometry node object here and work on this material. So let's change the emission to be white. Nothing's happening. Why is that? Well, that's one thing people forget a lot of the times. Still nothing's visible, and that's because we have not applied our material to our geometry nodes system. And we can do this by adding in a set material node, plugging it in between the instance on points and the group output in this case, and selecting our material here. Now, if you hop on back over to shading, everything is working fine. I'm going to set the emission strength to be about 7 or so. Now let's go to the render properties here and enable bloom. Final step for the material is actually we want to change the color of some of these icospheres randomly, basically. What we can do to do that is add in an object info node. And if you plug in this random value into our emission color, you will see we now get a random black and white value for each of these icospheres. I'm going to plug in a color ramp, and basically what we can tell Blender right now, okay, so how much black do we want? How much white do we want? But we can also do this with colors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to a constant gradient. And if I now drag in this white value, we'll see more and more and more start appearing. I'm going to go about halfway on the white here. And instead of black, which basically means no emission, so they are invisible, I'm going to change the black color to be a nice orange color. So first of all, let's go to white and then let's take this into a bright orange like so. And I'm going to add in another stop, so another color stop here. And I'm going to change this guy to be blue like this. And with the random inputs, if I use it like this, you will see just white. That doesn't work. But if we use the random input, Blender basically will say, okay, so this gray value needs to be blue and this gray value needs to be orange, basically generating a random effect per particle or per icosphere, if you will. Obviously, you can change this to any color that you want. You can also just disable this, make the entire thing blue if you want to. That's all up to you. Get creative and make something that you like out of it. All right, so the final step is to render this thing out. And we can simply do this by going over to the output properties, making sure everything is set up correctly. So I have full HD in this case, 30 FPS, and the end of our frame range is basically the end of our song, which makes sense, of course. And I want to render this out as an FFmpeg video. Go into the encoding tab and make sure we have MP4 selected as the container. For the output quality, I want to use perceptually lossless. And very important to note, if you want audio to be exported within Blender, make sure to change your audio codec to AAC, which is a good codec, which is compatible with both iPhone, Android, and lots of other devices. So if you want to make sure it works on everybody's device, make sure to use AAC as the audio codec. So that wraps up the video. I hope you enjoyed it. The project file for this video is available on my Patreon. So please consider becoming a patron. It really helps the channel out a lot. I want to thank you for watching and see you in the next one. Also, a big shout out and thanks to the following people for supporting the channel.